Hello students, today we are going to start chapter 4, and chapter 4 is all about relationships and how we can represent relationships in lots of different ways. And the first relationship that we're going to look at is going to be something about football, because you know it's football season, it's actually Saturday and there's a lot of big games today, so we're going to talk about some football. If that offends you, I apologize. So we need to be on page 32 in our composition books, and the title for today is 4.1 Represent Relationships. Well, one of the big things in football is touchdowns. So what happens if a team scores a touchdown? If they score one touchdown, they get 6 points. Now we're not going to be concerned with the point after because we're just going to talk about the touchdowns right now. We may bring the point after later. But what happens if they score 2 touchdowns? Then they get 12 points. Well, what if they score 3 touchdowns? Then they get 18 points, exactly. Now, one way that we can represent relationships is a table. And the tables always have 2 columns. What we have seen before is X and a Y, but you know, sometimes we need different variables to represent what we're doing. So this would be T for the number of touchdowns, and it's not going to fit, but you can see that. And this is going to be P for the total points. Okay, I apologize, that's kind of sloppy, but you can write it in your composition book neatly. So we've got a table. If I score 1 touchdown, I get 6 points. 2 touchdowns, 12 points. 3 touchdowns, 18 points. That is the first way to represent a relationship. Our relationship between touchdowns and points. And the first way that we can represent it is a table. The second way we can we can represent the relationships is through an equation. So what is the equation that we could write down for this relationship? I wonder how we could write this, because typically in a relationship like this, we're always going to make the right column equal something times the left column and maybe add a few things in there, whatever. Okay, but let's look at this. How would I write this? P equals what times T? I need to put a hook on that so it's not a plus sign. P equals what times T? Well, you know from last chapter that what goes in here, this looks a whole lot like y equals mx. That's the slope. Well, what's my slope in this relationship? My slope is the change in y plus 6 over the change in x plus 1. So that would be 6 over 1. So my equation would be P, whatever's in this column, equals 6 times whatever's in the T column. So far, in representing relationships, we've talked about creating a table. That's one way. And then writing our equation is the second way. Well, the third way is in a graph. We can create a graph for our relationship. So let's graph it. Well, because we're only dealing with positive numbers, I only need to deal with quadrant 1, which is right here. I don't need to deal with all these others because, you know, you can't have negative touchdowns and negative points. You can have negative yards, but that's another story altogether. We'll just talk about the points. So let's graph it. I'm going to go by 1s in my X column. And we know that X is the number of touchdowns. And then my Y value is going to be the total number of points. So since each of mine is by 6, I'm just going to go by 6s. And so it'll be 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36. And this is number of points. So let's graph it. 1 touchdown, 6 points. 1 touchdown, 6 points. And that point is 1, 6. 2 touchdowns, 12 points. 2 touchdowns, 12 points. 3 touchdowns, 18 points. 3 touchdowns, 18 points. And the cool thing about this is I can use the graph to make predictions. Like, for instance, what if I said how many points are they going to get if they score 10 touchdowns? So I could just keep going up this would be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and figure out where on my graph 10 touchdowns would be. So that's the way I could use this form of representing a relationship to make predictions. So far we have a graph, sorry, this is the graph, a table, and an equation. So that's 3 ways to represent exactly the same information. Table, equation, and graph. The next way that we want to talk about representing a relationship is through a description. And our description is always a verbal description, so we have to write words. So what in the world can we say about this graph? Using fancy words to describe exactly what's going on here. Well, we know we have to use our variable t for touchdowns and our variable p for points, and we need to explain what both of those represent. So we could say something like, for every touchdown, comma t, that represents what the touchdown is. The team earns 6 points, and then we'll do P so that we know exactly what P represents on the graph. So this is a simple verbal description of what's going on in our table and in our equation and in our graph. So 4 different ways to represent all of the same information. Now what we're going to be doing throughout this whole chapter is taking each of those 4 representations and then drawing all the others. But wait, there's one more left. And this one is probably brand new, something that you have never seen before. And it's called a mapping. And a mapping is very much like a table, except there's no lines. We have ovals. So we're going to do a mapping. I have my first column, which is touchdowns, and my second column, which is P, for points. So I'm going to write down how many touchdowns, and I'm going to put an oval around it. And then I'm going to write how many points. That would be 6, 12, 18. And that's my first part of the mapping. But right now I don't know exactly which points go with which numbers go with which, all that. So I have to draw arrows to identify which numbers go together. So I know that 1 goes with 6. I also know that 2 goes with 12 and 3 goes with 18. So in a mapping, I'm mapping out which numbers go with which, and then that's why I use the arrows. So again, you can see how that looks a whole lot like a table. I've still got 2 columns of numbers, but instead of putting the lines in the boxes, I put ovals around the numbers and then draw lines to the ones that match. That is called a mapping. And again, what we're going to be doing throughout this chapter is taking each one of these 5 different representations: mapping, table, description, graph, and equation, and then figuring out how to do all of the rest of them. So, it's going to be a chapter of interpreting a lot of information, and I know you can do it. The last thing I'd like for you to do before you close the video is to come up with one question that you have about everything that we've talked about in this video. Is there still something that's a little bit unclear, something that's a little fuzzy? Will you please send me one question as a direct post in Edmodo, and that way on Monday I can answer those questions in class.